So let's go back a little bit and kind of level set for people. So Roko is a noun that was bought by 4156. It has the computer head. It has the Ethereum logo on the shirt. It's kind of the perfect noun to be the AI participant. Can you explain and kind of dive in a little more technically into GPT-3, which is what Rocco is? Because you hear stuff that GPT-3 has 175 billion parameters trained on all this data. It's a large language model. There are transformers. Can you kind of explain to people that don't understand what all that means, kind of the different parts of it?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty high level, but like there's some really great explanations out there. Andre Karpathy is a famous AI researcher and he's put out a lot of content on transformers. So if you're interested in like the technical stuff, you can definitely find some resources out there, but I'll kind of keep it at a high level. So the big deal of these large language models is a lot behind this concept of self-supervised learning. So in the past with machine learning, often what you'd have to do is you'd have to give it examples or give it data to learn from, right? So you can be like, all right, this is a picture of a cat. This is a picture of a dog. Here's a bunch of different examples. All right, now here's a new picture. Tell me if it's a cat or a dog. That's something called supervised learning. Then you have unsupervised learning, which is just like learning patterns in data. So giving unstructured data and just trying to find patterns on it. And then there's something called self-supervised learning, which is what these large language models use. That's kind of a mix of the two. So this idea is that instead of having to have like a bunch of data on like, this is an input, this is your output, this is what we want, it can just hold a lot of information kind of as context. So when you hear like, 175 billion parameters, one way of thinking about that is kind of like the number of neurons you have in your brain. And now we're getting a little bit into like neuroscience and how it like overlaps with machine learning and AI. But this idea is that each one of the neurons in your brain is like a perceptron in machine learning and is responsible for like identifying how a very specific part of an input can impact a very specific part of the output. And when you put a whole bunch of those together, it gets like really good. And this works really well with these models because they were just fed hundreds of gigabytes of data and from content on the internet, from forums to like books in the public domain to Stack Overflow to everything really. And you can look into some of how some of these open source ones are trained, like Eleuther AI trained something on what's called the pile, which is just a ton of data that you can look at. But it has all this data now like in its kind of memory almost. And then you only need to provide it with very few examples for it to get kind of the gist of what you're saying now because it has so much more context. So for example, what we're doing with Rocco a bit, it's like, all right, here's an example of a proposal, create a summary for that. And after, it does that a few times, you can take that summary, which is going to be pretty good, and you edit it. You have some subject matter experts. Right now, we have some volunteers from Nouns who have been amazing that go through and kind of change it to make sure that it is really like a better response. It's like a human level response if it wasn't in that case. And then you can kind of like associate that initial data that you passed in with now your perfect response out. And typically with machine learning, you'd need like hundreds of or thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of those examples. But with this new self-supervised learning, because it holds all that information in context, you only need really like 50, 100, or a couple hundred examples for it to get really good at that specific task. So that's kind of like a high level breakdown of what self-supervised learning is and what these large language models are. GPT is the most famous of the large language models, and it's created by OpenAI. And it's closed source, but they have a very good API that you can use with it. And it's not that pricey. They just reduced all of their prices by 2/3 this month. Worth messing around with. But there's definitely other open source, alternatives. Forefront.ai is a cool website where you can train open source alternatives to it. We're specifically using GPT-3 as the back end of this model just because it's really performant and has a higher ease of use. But we're not kind of locking ourselves into any infrastructure because the really key piece here is the data, which we could pass into any model and open source or otherwise.